Emma by Jane Austen. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in Mr. Woodhouse's family, less as a governess than a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. Sorrow came, a gentle sorrow, but not at all in the shape of any disagreeable consciousness. Miss Taylor married. It was on the wedding day of this beloved friend that Emma first sat in mournful thought of any continuance. The wedding over, and the bride people gone, her father and herself were left to dine together, with no prospect of a third to cheer a long evening. Her father composed himself to sleep after dinner, as usual, and she had then only to sit and think of what she had lost. How was she to bear the change? It was true that her friend was going only half a mile from them, but Emma was aware that great must be the difference between a Mrs. Weston only half a mile from them and a Miss Taylor in the house. Her sister, Isabella, being settled in London, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long October and November evening must be struggled through at Hartfield before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabella and her husband and their little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again. Highbury, the large and populous Surrey village to which Hartfield, in spite of its separate lawn and shrubberies and name, did really belong, afforded her many acquaintances, but not one among them who could be accepted in lieu of Miss Taylor, even for half a day. It was a melancholy change, and Emma could not but sigh over it and wish for impossible things, till her father awoke and made it necessary to be cheerful. The backgammon table was placed, but a visitor immediately afterwards walked in and made it unnecessary. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man about 7 or 38, was not only a very old and intimate friend of the family, but particularly connected with it as the elder brother of Isabella's husband, John. He lived about a mile from Highbury and was always welcome, and at this time more welcome than usual, as coming directly from their mutual connections in London. He had walked up to Hartfield to say that all were well in Brunswick Square. Mr. Woodhouse gratefully observed, "It is very kind of you, Mr. Knightley, to come out at this late hour to call upon us. I'm afraid you must have had a shocking walk." "Not at all, sir. It is a beautiful moonlit night, and so mild that I must draw back from your great fire. By the by, I have not wished you joy, being pretty well aware of what sort of joy you must both be feeling. I've been in no hurry with my congratulations, but I hope it all went off tolerably well. How did you all behave? Who cried most?" "Ah, poor Miss Taylor, 'tis a sad business." "Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, if you please, but I cannot possibly say poor Miss Taylor. At any rate, it must be better for her to have only one to please rather than 2. "Especially when one of those is such a fanciful, troublesome creature," said Emma playfully. "That is what you have in your head, I know, and what you would certainly say if father were not by." "Oh, I believe it is very true, my dear, indeed. Oh," said Mr. Woodhouse with a sigh. "I'm afraid I'm sometimes very fanciful and troublesome." "My dearest papa, you do not think I could mean you, or suppose Mr. Knightley to mean you? What a horrible idea! Oh, no, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know, in a joke. It's all a joke. We always say what we like to one another." Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. "Well," said Emma, "you want to hear about the wedding, and I shall be happy to tell you, for we all behaved charmingly. And you have forgotten one matter of joy to me, a very considerable one, that I made the match myself. I made the match 4 years ago, and to have it take place and be proved in the right when so many people said Mr. Weston would never marry again may comfort me for anything." Her father fondly replied, "Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things, for whatever you say always comes to pass. Pray do not make any more matches." "Only one more, Papa, only for Mr. Elton. Poor Mr. Elton! I must look about for a wife for him. I thought when he was joining their hands today he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind office done for him." "Mr. Elton is a very pretty young man, to be sure, but if you want to show him any attention, my dear, ask him to come and dine with us some day. That will be a much better thing. I dare say Mr. Knightley will be so kind as to meet him." "With a great deal of pleasure, sir," said Mr. Knightley, laughing, "and I agree with you entirely that it will be a much better thing. Invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife." Mr. Woodhouse was fond of society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him. Real, long-standing regard brought the Westons and Mr. Knightley. As for Mr. Elton, the privilege of exchanging a vacant evening of his own blank solitude for the elegancies and society of Mr. Woodhouse's drawing-room was in no danger of being thrown away. After these came a second set, among the most come-at-able of whom were Mrs. and Miss Bates and Mrs. Goddard, 3 ladies almost always at the service of an invitation from Hartfield. Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, lived with her single daughter and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady can excite. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school, where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price. Mrs. Goddard's school was in high repute, and very deservedly. These were the ladies whom Emma found herself very frequently able to collect, and happy was she for her father's sake. One morning a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard, requesting to be allowed to bring a Miss Smith with her when next she visited, a most welcome request, for Miss Smith was a girl of 17 whom Emma knew very well by sight and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of parlour boarder. That was all that was generally known of her history. She was a very pretty girl, short, plump and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of great sweetness. And at that first meeting Emma was as much pleased with her manners as her person, and quite determined to continue the acquaintance. Harriet Smith's intimacy at Hartfield was soon a settled thing. Quick and decided in her ways, Emma lost no time in encouraging her to come very often, and as their acquaintance increased, so did their satisfaction in each other. Harriet certainly was not clever, but she had a sweet, docile, grateful disposition, and was totally free from conceit, only desiring to be guided by anyone she looked up to. Mrs. Goddard and the teachers and the girls and the affairs of the school in general formed naturally a great part of her conversation, and but for her acquaintance with the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm, it must have been the whole. But the Martins occupied her thoughts a good deal. She had spent 2 very happy months with them, and now loved to talk of the pleasures of her visit and describe the many comforts and wonders of the place. Emma particularly led Harriet to talk more of Mr. Robert Martin, and there was evidently no dislike to it. Harriet was very ready to dwell a good deal upon his being so very good-humoured and obliging. They met Mr. Martin as they were walking on the Donwell Road one day. He was on foot, and after looking very respectfully at Emma, looked with most unfeigned satisfaction at her companion. Emma was not sorry to have such an opportunity of survey, and walking a few yards forwards while they talked together soon made her quick eye sufficiently acquainted with Mr. Robert Martin. They remained but a few minutes together, and Harriet then came running to her with a smiling face and in a flutter of spirits. "Well, Miss Woodhouse, is he like what you expected? What do you think of him? Do you think him so very plain?" "He is very plain, undoubtedly, remarkably plain, but that is nothing compared with his entire want of gentility." "To be sure," said Harriet, in a mortified voice, "he is not so genteel as a real gentleman." "I think, Harriet, since your acquaintance with us, you have been repeatedly in the company of some such very real gentleman that you must yourself be struck with the difference in Mr. Martin. At Hartfield you have had very good specimens of well-educated, well-bred men. I should be surprised if, after seeing them, you could be in the company with Mr. Martin again without perceiving him to be a very inferior creature." Mr. Elton was the very person fixed on by Emma for driving the young farmer out of Harriet's head. She thought it would be an excellent match. She had already satisfied herself that he thought Harriet a beautiful girl, which she trusted was foundation enough on his side, and on Harriet's there could be little doubt that the idea of being preferred by him would have all the usual weight and efficacy. And he was really a very pleasing young man whom any woman, not fastidious, might like. Very soon, circumstances produced a fresh occasion for Emma's services towards her friend. Harriet had been at Hartfield, as usual, soon after breakfast, and after a time had gone home to dinner. She returned, with an agitated, hurried look, announcing something extraordinary to have happened. She had heard, as soon as she got back to Mrs. Goddard's, that Mr. Martin had been there an hour before and had left a little parcel for her from one of his sisters and gone away, and on opening this parcel she had actually found, besides the 2 songs which she had lent Elizabeth Martin to copy, a letter to herself. And this letter was from him, from Mr. Martin, and contained a direct proposal of marriage. "Will you read the letter?" cried Harriet. "Pray do. I'd rather you would." Emma read, and was surprised. The style of the letter was much above her expectation. She paused over it while Harriet stood anxiously watching for her opinion, and was at last forced to add, "Is it a good letter?" "Yes, indeed, a very good letter," replied Emma, rather slowly. "A better written letter, Harriet, than I had expected." "Well," said Harriet. "Well, and, what shall I do?" "You must answer it, of course, and speedily." "Yes, but what shall I say? Dear Miss Woodhouse, do advise me." "Oh, no, no. The letter had much better be all your own. Expressions of gratitude and concern for the pain you are inflicting will present themselves unbidden to your mind." "You think I ought to refuse him, then?" said Harriet, looking down. "Ought to refuse him? My dear Harriet, what do you mean? Are you in any doubt as to that?" Harriet was silent. Emma continued. "You mean to return a favourable answer, I collect." "Oh, no, I do not. That is, I do not mean... What shall I do? What would you advise me to do? Oh, pray, dear Miss Woodhouse, tell me what I ought to do." "I shall not give you any advice, Harriet. I will have nothing to do with it.